There are moments in life when everything you've built in silence comes crashing into the light, uninvited and unforgiving. For Margaret Hayes, that moment arrived on a humid Thanksgiving evening in Charleston, South Carolina, when her younger sister's careless words shattered 35 years of carefully maintained distance. $12 million. That's what her family discovered she was worth, not through celebration or pride, but through accident and envy. This is a story about the invisible child who became extraordinary, about the price of being overlooked, and about the strange mathematics of family love where success doesn't equal acceptance, but rather accusation. I had always known this day would come, Margaret would later reflect, but I never imagined it would feel like standing trial for the crime of succeeding alone. The old Charleston families have a saying, blood runs thick as molasses in July. But what happens when that blood carries more poison than nourishment? Margaret's story begins not with her fortune, but with her invisibility. A girl born into a home where love was rationed like wartime supplies, where one child absorbed all the light while another learned to thrive in shadow. She didn't set out to become a multimillionaire. She set out to become someone who mattered, even if only to herself. Along the way, she discovered that antique cameos and Victorian brooches could speak truths that her family never would, that value exists independent of recognition, that authenticity can be measured and verified, and that sometimes the most precious things are the ones others walk past without seeing. By the time her family sat down to their Thanksgiving turkey, Margaret had authenticated jewelry for museums, celebrities, and collectors across 3 continents. She had flown first class to Paris and London. She had built an empire from expertise and instinct. And yet, to her parents and sister, she remained Maggie from the antique shop, the dependable one, the plain one, the one who never caused trouble because she was never worth noticing. This story will take you through the architecture of neglect, how it's built, room by room, year by year, until a child learns that survival means building her own foundation elsewhere. You'll see how Margaret transformed childhood invisibility into adult excellence, how she turned her family's indifference into fuel for an ambition they would never understand. We'll walk through the auction houses of Charleston where she first learned to see what others missed, through the years of silent triumph as her business grew beyond anything her family could imagine, and finally to that Thanksgiving table where the truth emerged not as vindication, but as condemnation. What happens when the family that ignored your struggle demands access to your success? What do you owe the people who taught you that you owed them nothing? By the end, you'll understand why Margaret's greatest acquisition wasn't a rare Cartier bracelet or a Tiffany pendant. It was the courage to authenticate her own worth and walk away from people who would always see her as counterfeit, no matter how genuine she became. The Hayes family home on Trad Street had the kind of charm that Charleston tourists photographed from the sidewalk. Wrought iron gates, azaleas blooming pink against whitewashed brick, a porch swing that creaked in the salt breeze. Inside, however, the beauty was reserved for one child alone. Margaret was 7 when she first understood the geography of her parents' attention. Her sister Caroline, 3 years younger, had been born with a heart murmur that turned every cold into a crisis, every cough into a vigil. Their mother, Patricia Hayes, transformed overnight from a junior league socialite into a full-time guardian of Caroline's fragile existence. Their father, Robert, a respected attorney downtown, simply redirected his emotional investment to match his wife's, as if love were a portfolio that required rebalancing. Margaret became the afterthought, the sturdy one, the child who required nothing because she would receive nothing regardless. School mornings revealed the hierarchy with brutal efficiency. Patricia would spend 40 minutes coaxing Caroline through breakfast, cutting her toast into perfect triangles, warming her milk to exact specifications, while Margaret ate standing at the counter, assembling her own lunch, signing her own permission slips. I learned early that asking for help was just another form of disappointment, Margaret would remember. When she made the honor roll in 4th grade, she placed the certificate on the refrigerator herself, where it remained unmentioned for 3 weeks before vanishing beneath Caroline's latest doctor's note. Her parents attended every one of Caroline's medical appointments with the solemnity of diplomats at treaty negotiations, but Margaret's piano recitals and science fairs occurred in their absence, explained away by scheduling conflicts that somehow never existed when Caroline needed them. The message was clear without ever being spoken. One daughter was precious and breakable. The other was functional and forgettable. The neighborhood children intuited what Margaret's parents broadcasted. Birthday parties came with invitations for Caroline. Delicate, special Caroline who needed gentle play and constant supervision. Margaret, the older sister, was expected to attend as caretaker, not as guest, hovering at the edges while other children played. She learned to become invisible in crowded rooms, a skill that would later serve her well in auction houses where the best observers remain unnoticed. At home, she discovered the library, not the family's decorative collection of leather-bound volumes in the study, but the public library on Calhoun Street, where she could disappear into books that promised her that somewhere, somehow, children like her mattered. She read voraciously, biographies of self-made women, historical accounts of people who'd transformed nothing into something, novels about orphans who survived through cleverness and determination. Each book was a blueprint, a promise that invisibility could be overcome, that being overlooked might actually be a strange kind of freedom. By middle school, Margaret had perfected the art of self-sufficiency. She woke herself, dressed herself, fed herself, and walked herself to school while her parents orchestrated Caroline's increasingly elaborate morning routine. She forged her father's signature on report cards because bringing them home for acknowledgement felt more humiliating than the forgery itself. She took on a paper route at 13, ostensibly to save for college, but really because earning her own money meant never having to ask her parents for anything, never having to hear the sigh of inconvenience that preceded every transaction. The irony wasn't lost on her even then. The child they treated as low maintenance had become genuinely independent out of sheer necessity. She wasn't self-sufficient by nature. She was self-sufficient by abandonment. And somewhere in those years of benign neglect, Margaret stopped waiting for her parents to notice her and started noticing herself instead. But the question remained, unspoken and unanswered. Could a child raised on emotional scraps ever truly believe she deserved a feast? High school arrived with the weight of inevitability. Another 4 years of being Caroline Hayes' older sister, the responsible one, the invisible one. But Margaret discovered something unexpected in those hallways. When your family doesn't see you, you're free to become whoever you want to be. She threw herself into academics with the single-minded focus of someone who understood that grades were the only currency that couldn't be redistributed to a needier sibling. Her teachers noticed what her parents didn't: a brilliant, hungry mind that devoured complex problems like other teenagers devoured gossip. She joined the debate team, not because she enjoyed confrontation, but because she needed to learn how to make people listen when they'd rather look away. She excelled in art history, drawn to the way experts could look at a painting and decode centuries of meaning from brushstrokes and pigment. There was something deeply satisfying about authentication, about the idea that truth could be verified, that value could be proven even when others doubted it. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, became the first adult who saw Margaret clearly. During a routine college planning meeting junior year, Mrs. Pritchard closed the door and asked the question no one else had thought to ask. "Margaret, where do you want to go?" Not where could she afford, not where was practical, but where did she want to be? The question cracked something open. Margaret found herself describing cities she'd only read about, museums she'd explored through library books, a life that existed beyond Charleston's careful boundaries and her family's careful neglect. Mrs. Pritchard listened, made notes, and then said something that would echo for decades. "You know what I see when I look at you? Someone who's been preparing for independence since she was old enough to walk. Most kids are terrified of leaving home. You've already left. You're just waiting for your body to catch up." She was right. Margaret would later reflect. I'd been gone for years. I'd just forgotten to close the door behind me. The college application process became Margaret's secret rebellion. While her parents obsessed over Caroline's high school selection, debating private schools with smaller class sizes, better nurse accessibility, more understanding administrators, Margaret quietly applied to 11 universities, all far from South Carolina, all with strong art history programs. She wrote essays about resilience and self-reliance that her English teacher called remarkably mature, and her mother never read. She secured a full academic scholarship to a respected liberal arts college in Virginia, along with grants that would cover housing and books. When she announced her acceptance at dinner one evening, her father looked up from cutting Caroline's chicken and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. When is it? The college. He thought she was talking about a college visit, not her entire future. Margaret didn't correct him. She finished her meal, excused herself, and went upstairs to her room where the acceptance letter was pinned to her bulletin board like a flag on conquered territory. Senior year was a countdown, each day bringing Margaret closer to a life her family couldn't diminish because they wouldn't be in it. She worked extra shifts at a local bookstore, saving money, building her escape fund. She watched Caroline's senior prom preparations consume weeks of family attention and thousands of dollars, the dress shopping expeditions, the professional hair and makeup trials, the anxiety over whether Caroline's stamina would hold through a full evening. Margaret's own prom came and went. She didn't attend, and no one noticed enough to ask why. The truth was, she didn't want to go. She wanted to leave, and on a sweltering August morning, she packed her life into her second-hand Honda Civic while her parents helped Caroline prepare for a doctor's appointment. She left a note on the kitchen counter. "Heading to college. I'll call when I get there. Love, Margaret." She didn't wait for goodbye because she'd been saying goodbye in small ways for years. As she drove north on Highway 17, Charleston's church steeples receding in her rearview mirror, Margaret felt something she couldn't quite name. Not quite joy, not quite relief, but something close to both. She was 18 years old, invisible no longer, at least not to herself. But could you ever truly escape the family that taught you you were forgettable? Or would that lesson follow you like a shadow, even into the brightest rooms? College was revelation and resurrection. At Hollins University in Roanoke, Margaret was simply Margaret. Not Caroline's sister, not the responsible one, not the daughter who required no attention because she expected none. Her art history professors recognized immediately what Margaret had always suspected. She had an extraordinary eye. She could look at a Renaissance painting and spot a later restoration that others missed. She could hold a piece of jewelry and sense, through some combination of weight and craftsmanship and intuition, whether it was genuine or reproduction. Her senior thesis on Victorian mourning jewelry earned distinction and caught the attention of a visiting lecturer from Sotheby's, who told her quite directly, "You should be working in auction houses, not writing about them." Margaret had never considered it. Auction houses seemed like rarefied spaces reserved for old money and inherited connections, not scholarship girls from South Carolina who'd paid their own way through college. But the idea took root. During those 4 years, Margaret went home exactly 6 times. Thanksgiving freshman year, Christmas sophomore year, a cousin's wedding, Caroline's high school graduation. Each visit confirmed what distance had clarified. She didn't belong in that house, had never belonged, would never belong. Her parents asked polite questions about her studies with the same mild interest they might show a neighbor's garden. Caroline, now in college herself and still the family's primary focus, talked endlessly about her classes, her roommate, her increasingly dramatic health crises that required frequent parental intervention. Margaret listened, contributed appropriately, and felt nothing except a detached anthropological curiosity. Was this what other families felt like? This performance of connection without actual intimacy? She called home monthly, obligatory 10-minute conversations where her mother provided updates on Caroline's life, and Margaret provided vague reassurances about her own. "Still studying art history?" her father would ask, as if it were a phase rather than a degree. "Still enjoying Virginia?" "Never." "What are you learning? What are you discovering? Who are you becoming?" The summer after graduation, Margaret made a decision that would alter everything. Instead of returning to Charleston, she accepted an internship at a prestigious auction house in Charleston. Quinn and Associates, established 1893, specializing in estate jewelry, fine art, and southern antiques. The irony pleased her. She was staying in her hometown but remaining separate from her family. Close enough geographically to maintain appearances, distant enough emotionally to protect the self she'd carefully constructed. She rented a tiny studio apartment in the French Quarter, 4 blocks from her parents' Trad Street home, but a world away in every way that mattered. Quinn and Associates occupied a renovated pre-revolutionary building on Church Street, all exposed brick and careful lighting designed to make everything look more valuable than it was. Margaret's role was entry-level, cataloging items, researching provenance, assisting senior appraisers, but she approached it with the intensity of someone who understood that competence was the only inheritance she'd ever receive. Her supervisor, an impeccably dressed woman named Vivian Caldwell, who wore her 60 years and 40-year career with equal elegance, recognized Margaret's talent within weeks. "You have what most people in this business lack," Vivian told her one afternoon as they examined an estate collection of cameo brooches. "You're not impressed by reputation or pedigree. You look at the object itself. You see what's actually there, not what someone wants it to be." It was, Margaret realized, the first time anyone had named her particular gift, the ability, honed through years of family and visibility, to see clearly without the distortion of sentiment or expectation. She could look at a supposedly Georgian locket and spot the Victorian-era clasp that revealed it as a later reproduction. She could examine a family heirloom diamond ring and identify the telltale signs of a 1970s setting. She wasn't cynical, she was accurate. And in the world of high-end authentication, accuracy was currency. Within 6 months, Vivian was bringing Margaret into client meetings, letting her handle increasingly significant pieces, trusting her eye when more senior staff disagreed. Margaret was becoming someone in the only way she'd ever understood, through excellence that couldn't be ignored, through value that could be verified, through a worth that existed independent of anyone's opinion. But late at night in her studio apartment, looking out at Charleston's glittering harbor, she sometimes wondered, if your family still couldn't see you, did it matter that strangers finally did? Margaret's breakthrough came during her second year at Quinn & Associates, when a wealthy widow from Kiowa Island brought in a collection of jewelry she'd inherited from her mother. The pieces looked unremarkable. Victorian brooches, Edwardian pendants, the kind of good but not exceptional items the auction house handled routinely. Margaret was assigned to catalog them, a task considered tedious enough for junior staff. But as she examined each piece under magnification, something made her pause. One brooch, a modest-looking mourning piece with woven hair under glass and seed pearls around the border, had markings that didn't match its apparent age. She spent 3 days researching, cross-referencing obscure auction records and museum databases, tracking down references in 19th-century jewelry maker registries that existed only in specialized archives. Finally, she found it. The brooch was the work of a now famous Charleston jewelry maker, created as part of a commemorative series after a yellow fever epidemic. Only 12 were known to exist. This was the 13th. When Margaret presented her findings to Vivian, complete with documentation and authentication trail, the older woman looked at her with something approaching wonder. "Do you understand what you've just done?" Vivian asked. "You've identified a piece that will sell for 40 times its estimated value. You've made this firm's reputation a little bit stronger, and you've proven you're not just good at this, you're exceptional." The brooch sold at auction for $68,000. The widow was thrilled. Quinn & Associates added Margaret's name to the catalog with the notation, "Authentication by M. Hayes." And Margaret felt for the first time since childhood the uncomplicated pleasure of being seen for exactly what she was, someone who could find value where others saw only the ordinary. Her parents, when she mentioned the sale casually during a rare phone call, said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately changed the subject to Caroline's latest medical appointment. The contrast was almost funny. Almost. The next 5 years were a masterclass in building a reputation. Margaret became Quinn & Associates' go-to expert for vintage and antique jewelry authentication. She developed relationships with museum curators, private collectors, and estate lawyers who appreciated her rigorous methodology and unshakable ethics. She turned down lucrative offers to authenticate pieces she couldn't verify with certainty, building trust through refusal as much as approval. She traveled: London for a Victorian jewelry symposium, New York for estate auctions, Paris to examine pieces at the Louvre that would inform her understanding of historical techniques. Each trip expanded not just her expertise, but her sense of possibility. She was 30 years old, successful in her field, financially stable, and emotionally independent. She bought a small historic house in Harleston Village that she renovated herself, room by room, choosing every paint color and light fixture with the care she brought to authentication. It was entirely hers, requiring no one's approval, reflecting no one's taste but her own. Her family remained cordially distant. They still saw her as Maggie with the antique shop job. a phrase her mother used that managed to be both affectionate and dismissive. Margaret never corrected the characterization, never explained that she was senior appraiser at Charleston's most prestigious auction house, that she'd authenticated pieces for the Smithsonian and the Met, that her name carried weight in her field. What would be the point? They demonstrated for 30 years that her achievements existed in a frequency they couldn't hear. Caroline, meanwhile, had married a cardiologist she'd met during one of her many medical consultations. Their parents threw an elaborate wedding that cost more than Margaret's college education, and was living in Mount Pleasant, still the center of family attention, despite now having a husband to manage her various ailments. Family dinners happened quarterly, dutiful gatherings where Margaret played her assigned role. The stable one, the single one, the one whose life was pleasant but unremarkable, requiring only brief acknowledgement before conversation returned to Caroline's renovated kitchen or latest health scare. Margaret attended, participated minimally, and left early. It was easier than explaining, easier than hoping for understanding that would never arrive. But with each passing year, a question grew louder. How long could she maintain this double life, extraordinary to the world but invisible to her family, before the contradiction became unbearable? At 35, Margaret made the decision that would define her future. She left Quinn and Associates to start her own firm. The decision wasn't reckless. She'd spent 2 years planning, building a client list, securing capital through careful savings, and a small business loan she didn't need, but took anyway to establish business credit. Heritage Authentication Services opened in a renovated carriage house off Meeting Street, just Margaret and an assistant, specializing in vintage jewelry authentication and appraisal. The business model was simple: offer museum-quality authentication services to private collectors, estate attorneys, and auction houses nationwide. Her reputation preceded her. Within 6 months, she had more clients than she could handle. Within a year, she hired 2 additional appraisers. Within 3 years, Heritage Authentication Services was the most trusted name in Southeastern jewelry authentication, with clients from Atlanta to Miami to Washington, D.C. The money came gradually, then suddenly. What started as a comfortable income became substantial wealth as Margaret's expertise allowed her to command premium rates and take on increasingly valuable collections. She authenticated a Cartier collection for a tech entrepreneur that netted her a $50,000 fee. She became the preferred appraiser for 3 major auction houses' jewelry departments. She was hired as expert witness in estate litigation cases where her testimony about a piece's authenticity or value carried legal weight. By 40, Margaret's annual income exceeded $500,000. By 43, she'd crossed into 7 figures. She invested wisely: real estate, index funds, a diversified portfolio managed by a fiduciary advisor who appreciated her risk tolerance and long-term thinking. She upgraded her Harleston Village house, bought a beach cottage on Sullivan's Island, drove a Tesla because it was practical and well-made, not because it announced wealth. She lived well, but not ostentatiously, her money a private satisfaction rather than public display. Through it all, her family remained oblivious. She never explicitly lied, but she never corrected their misapprehensions. When her mother mentioned, "Your little antique business," Margaret said nothing. When her father asked if she was getting by okay financially, she said she was comfortable. When Caroline, who'd become a somewhat demanding younger sister in adulthood, occasionally asked for loans to cover her perpetual home renovation projects or medical bills her insurance didn't cover, Margaret helped. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Amounts that Caroline treated as significant, but that represented less than Margaret spent on her quarterly estimated tax payments. Caroline never asked where the money came from, never wondered how Maggie with the antique shop could afford such generosity. She simply accepted it as Margaret's role: the stable, responsible older sister who solved problems and required nothing in return. The truth was, the distance allowed Margaret to be generous without resentment. These weren't obligations, they were choices. She could afford to help Caroline precisely because Caroline's life and demands remained separate from hers. But the double life had its costs. Margaret dated occasionally but never seriously, unable or unwilling to build intimacy with anyone when she'd never managed it with her own family. She had professional colleagues and friendly acquaintances, but few deep friendships, having learned early that revealing yourself fully meant risking invisibility or misunderstanding. She traveled alone, celebrated successes privately, and told herself that independence was victory, that needing no one meant no one could disappoint her. And perhaps it was true. Perhaps the girl who'd learned to pack her own lunches and sign her own permission slips had simply grown into a woman who preferred self-sufficiency to vulnerability, who'd transformed childhood neglect into adult autonomy so successfully that she'd forgotten they weren't the same thing. On her 45th birthday, Margaret sat in her Sullivan's Island cottage watching the sun set over the Atlantic, a glass of excellent wine in hand, and realized that she'd built an extraordinary life that no one who'd known her longest understood or even knew existed. Was that freedom, or was it just another form of invisibility? Self-imposed this time, but invisible nonetheless. The question had no answer, at least not yet. But it was about to become urgent in a way Margaret couldn't predict, because family secrets, even successful ones, have a way of demanding revelation at the most inconvenient moments. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it. The Thanksgiving invitation arrived in October, as it did every year, but this one carried additional weight. Patricia Hayes was turning 75, and Caroline had decided the holiday would double as a birthday celebration. Just close family, Caroline wrote in her email, which Margaret knew meant herself, their parents, Caroline's husband David, and Margaret. Mother keeps saying she doesn't see you enough, Maggie. It would mean a lot if you came. Margaret felt the familiar tug of obligation mixed with resignation. She'd grown skilled at these minimal contact visits, arriving punctually, participating pleasantly, leaving early with excuses about work or prior commitments. She could manage 4 hours on a Thursday afternoon. She RSVP'd yes, bought an expensive but impersonal gift, cashmere throw blankets from a boutique downtown, and prepared herself mentally for an afternoon of being simultaneously present and invisible. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, Margaret noticed Caroline calling more frequently than usual, always with some small request or question. Could Margaret pick up a specific vintage serving platter she'd seen at an antique mall and thought their mother would love? Did Margaret know where to find real low-country oysters this time of year? The calls were pleasant but persistent, and Margaret accommodated them with the same good-natured compliance she'd practiced for decades. She didn't mention that she was in the middle of authenticating a private collection for a Dubai-based collector, work that would net her firm $300,000. She didn't mention that she'd just been interviewed for an article in Southern Living about Charleston's hidden experts. She didn't mention that her investment portfolio had recently crossed $12 million. These facts existed in a parallel universe that never intersected with the universe where she was still Maggie, the helpful older sister who bought serving platters and sourced oysters because she had time and Caroline was busy. Thanksgiving morning, Margaret dressed carefully. Nice but not too nice. Expensive but not obviously so. The kind of understated elegance that wouldn't register to people who'd decided long ago what she was worth. She drove to her parents' Trad Street house, parking behind Caroline's Lexus SUV, carrying the cashmere throws and a bottle of wine that cost more than she'd ever admit. Inside, the house smelled of turkey and sweet potato casserole, and her mother was orchestrating the meal with the precision of a military campaign while Caroline supervised from a dining room chair, directing placement of centerpieces and candles. "Maggie!" her mother called, accepting the gift without opening it, already asking if Margaret could help with something in the kitchen. Margaret complied, falling into the familiar rhythm of useful invisibility. Her father greeted her warmly but vaguely, the way he might greet a pleasant neighbor. David, Caroline's husband, was on his phone, managing some medical emergency by text. It was all exactly as expected, exactly as always. Dinner proceeded through its traditional stages: awkward small talk, grateful toasts, the careful navigation of topics that might or might not trigger one of Caroline's health anxieties. Margaret ate, answered questions about her business, with pleasant non-specifics, and waited for the evening to end. Then, over pumpkin pie, Caroline's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned. and suddenly her expression shifted into something Margaret couldn't immediately read. Surprise, perhaps, mixed with something sharper. "Maggie," Caroline said slowly, her voice carrying across the table in a way that made everyone look up. "Why is there an alert on my LinkedIn that you've been featured in Charleston Business Journal's Top 50 Entrepreneurs Under 50? The room went silent. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She'd forgotten about that interview from 6 months ago, forgotten that it had mentioned her firm's revenue and client list, forgotten that social media algorithms don't respect carefully maintained boundaries. Caroline was reading from her phone now, her voice taking on a strange tone. Heritage Authentication Services, founded by Margaret Hayes, specializes in high-value jewelry authentication for collectors and institutions worldwide. The firm, which employs 8 specialists, reportedly generates over $3 million annually, with Hayes herself estimated to have a net worth exceeding $12 million. Margaret watched her family's faces transform, confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and knew, with terrible certainty, that the carefully separated worlds she'd maintained for decades were about to collide in ways she couldn't control. The aftermath of Caroline's revelation was immediate and brutal. Her father demanded to know if it was true. Her mother looked wounded, as if Margaret had committed some betrayal by succeeding privately. Caroline's expression had shifted from surprise to something harder. Calculation mixed with injury, as if Margaret's undisclosed wealth was a personal affront. "Is this real?" Patricia asked, her voice tight. "You have $12 million? Margaret could have softened it, could have explained the difference between net worth and liquid assets, could have downplayed or deflected. But decades of being invisible had left her with one skill above all others: honesty that came from not caring about the outcome. "Yes," she said simply, "more or less. It's my business, my work. I built it over 15 years. The words landed like stones in water, creating ripples that would expand for months. What followed wasn't celebration or pride, but interrogation and accusation. How had she hidden this? Why had she hidden this? Robert, the attorney, immediately began asking about tax implications and legal structures, as if Margaret's success was somehow suspicious rather than earned. Patricia kept saying she didn't understand. If Margaret had this kind of money, why hadn't she mentioned it? Why had she let them think she was just getting by? But it was Caroline's reaction that cut deepest. "You've been lying to us for years," she said, her voice shaking with anger Margaret had never heard directed at her before. "Every time I asked you for money, every time I borrowed from you, you acted like you were just being a helpful sister. But you're rich, Maggie. You've been rich this whole time. And you let me feel guilty about taking a few $1,000s from you when you have millions." Margaret tried to explain that she'd never felt imposed upon, that she'd helped because she wanted to, that her money and Caroline's needs had nothing to do with each other. But Caroline wasn't listening. She was recalculating years of interactions through a new lens, turning generosity into deception, independence into betrayal. The holiday dissolved into chaos. David tried to mediate, suggesting they all calm down and discuss this later. Robert demanded financial specifics. What exactly did Margaret do? Who were her clients? How had she accumulated this much? Patricia kept repeating that she couldn't believe Margaret had kept such a secret, that families don't hide things like this from each other. And through it all, Margaret felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. These people had ignored her successes for decades, her scholarship, her career growth, her business launch. Now they were angry that she hadn't insisted they pay attention. Now they cared about her life, but only because it had monetary value they could quantify. She tried to explain calmly that she'd never lied, that she'd simply lived her life privately, that they'd never asked questions that would have required her to disclose details. "You never wanted to know before," she said quietly. "You still don't want to know about the work or the expertise or the years of building this. You just want to know about the money." The truth of it hung in the air, and no one contradicted her because no one could. The evening ended with Margaret leaving early, her mother's birthday gift unopened on the side table, her father's face red with frustration, Caroline crying in the kitchen about feeling deceived and manipulated. Margaret drove home to her Harleston village house, poured herself a bourbon, and sat in the dark living room she'd decorated with such care, feeling nothing except a weary recognition. This was always going to happen. The moment her family saw her as something other than what they'd decided she was, they would feel threatened rather than proud, accused rather than celebratory. She'd built a fortune by seeing value where others missed it, by authenticating what was genuine and exposing what was false. Perhaps it was time to apply those same skills to her family relationships. What was genuine here? What was actually worth preserving? As she finished her drink and went to bed, Margaret realized that the revelation hadn't changed anything fundamental. Her family still didn't see her. They saw her money. They'd spent 45 years treating her as if she required nothing, and now they were angry that she'd taken them at their word. She had authenticated jewels for royalty and museums. Tomorrow, she would have to authenticate whether these family bonds, worn thin by decades of neglect, were genuine enough to repair, or merely beautiful fakes that looked real until you examined them closely. And what do you do when the people who raised you fail every test of authenticity you know how to apply? The weeks after Thanksgiving brought a barrage of contact Margaret had never experienced from her family. Phone calls, texts, emails, all centered on money. Her father wanted to discuss family estate planning and suggested Margaret could establish trusts for her parents' care. Her mother sent articles about children supporting aging parents, with pointed comments about how nice it must be to have resources to help. Caroline cycled between guilt-tripping. "I can't believe you watched me stress about money while you were secretly rich," and direct requests. She needed help with David's student loans from medical school. Their house needed foundation work. She was considering a procedure her insurance wouldn't cover. Each request came wrapped in accusation. Margaret had money, therefore Margaret owed it to them, and her previous generosity proved she'd been manipulating them all along by not giving enough when she could have given everything. Margaret tried initially to maintain boundaries with compassion. She explained that her business required capital, that net worth and available cash were different things, that she'd built her wealth through careful management and couldn't simply distribute it on demand. She reminded them that she'd never refused to help when asked, that she'd been generous within the bounds of what seemed appropriate. But the requests escalated. Robert wanted her to invest in a friend's business venture. Patricia suggested Margaret could buy a larger house where the whole family could vacation together. Caroline presented a spreadsheet of loans she'd received over the years and argued that if Margaret had that kind of wealth, those loans should have been gifts, and therefore she shouldn't have to feel grateful for them. The logic was circular and exhausting. Margaret's success was evidence of her selfishness because she hadn't shared it sufficiently, and her privacy about that success proved she'd been deliberately withholding from people she should have supported more generously. The breaking point came in early January, during what was supposed to be a calm family lunch to clear the air. Margaret arrived hoping for reconciliation, or at least understanding. Instead, she walked into an intervention. Her parents and Caroline had prepared talking points. They wanted Margaret to establish a family fund that would support everyone's needs. They wanted her to commit to covering her parents' potential long-term care costs. They wanted her to give Caroline a substantial gift to make up for the years of helping with smaller amounts. And beneath it all was the same theme. Margaret had violated an unspoken family contract by succeeding without their knowledge or permission, and she owed them compensation for that betrayal. When Margaret suggested that her success was her own, earned through her work and vision, Caroline said something that would end any possibility of reconciliation. "You only succeeded because Mom and Dad didn't burden you the way they burdened me. You got to be selfish your whole life because I was sick. You owe us for that freedom." Margaret stood up from the table, gathered her coat, and spoke with a clarity she'd been building toward for months. "I owe you nothing," she said, not with anger but with finality. "You're right that I had freedom you didn't have, Caroline. But that freedom came from being ignored, not from being unburdened. You were the center of everything, and I was the afterthought. I built my life alone because I had no choice. I became successful because I had to. No one was going to take care of me or celebrate me or even notice me unless I made myself impossible to overlook. And even now, you don't see me. You see my bank account. You're not proud of what I built. You're resentful that I built it without you, and angry that it's mine." She looked at each of them. Her father with his attorney's calculation, her mother with her wounded entitlement, Caroline with her familiar position as the victim of every circumstance. "I spent 45 years waiting for you to ask about my life, my work, what mattered to me. You never did. And now that you finally care, it's only because you want something from me." Patricia started to protest, to say that wasn't fair, that they'd always loved Margaret, that family was supposed to help family. But Margaret was done. "You loved the version of me that was convenient," she said quietly. "The stable one, the one who didn't need anything, the one who showed up and helped and never complicated your life with Caroline. That was fine when I accepted it, but I don't accept it anymore. I'm not interested in performing gratitude for attention that only showed up when money was involved." She walked to the door, then turned back one last time. "I'll always be your daughter and your sister, but I'm done being your afterthought, and I'm done being your resource. If you ever want to know me as I actually am, not as someone whose job is to support Caroline, not as someone whose worth is measured by my usefulness to you, then reach out. But if this is all you want from me, if money is the only language you can speak where I'm concerned, then we're done." She walked out into the January cold, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look back to see if anyone followed. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's phone was silent. No calls, no texts, no emails. Her family had chosen their response to her boundary, and it was absence. The same absence she'd experienced her entire childhood, but now weaponized as punishment rather than neglect. Margaret felt the loss, but not in the way she'd expected. It wasn't grief for what she'd had, but clarity about what she'd never had. She'd been mourning this family her whole life, grieving their inattention in real time, learning to live with the hollow space where unconditional love should have been. This final break wasn't the wound. It was just the moment she stopped pretending the wound didn't exist. She threw herself into her work with renewed purpose, expanding heritage authentication services, taking on prestigious projects, traveling to London and Paris and New York. She started mentoring young women in her field, offering the guidance and recognition she'd once craved. She began to build, slowly and cautiously, deeper friendships with people who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. 6 months after that final family lunch, Margaret was featured in a national business magazine for her expertise and entrepreneurial success. The article included a photo of her in her office, surrounded by the tools of her trade, loops and scales and reference books, the physical manifestation of a career built on seeing clearly and valuing accurately. She posted it on social media with a simple caption, 15 years of building something that matters. Caroline liked the post. Patricia commented, "Proud of you," with a heart emoji. Robert sent a text, "Great article, sweetheart. Let us know when you want to get together." They were exactly the kind of responses she'd wanted her whole life. Acknowledgement, pride, interest. And they meant absolutely nothing because they were still about the achievement, the public recognition, the version of Margaret that looked impressive from the outside. They weren't about her. They'd never been about her. And Margaret realized, with a peace she hadn't known she was capable of feeling, that she didn't need them to be. She'd authenticated her own worth years ago, built her own foundation, created her own value independent of their recognition. The girl who'd packed her own lunches and signed her own permission slips had grown into a woman who could also write her own story, star in her own life, and walk away from people who would always see her as supporting cast in someone else's drama. But the hardest truth remained. How do you forgive yourself for wanting love from people who were never capable of giving it? And how do you stop that want from echoing through every quiet moment? Margaret Hayes' story isn't about money, though money plays its part. It's about the strange mathematics of family, where love gets distributed unequally, and children learn to live with whatever portion they're assigned. It's about invisibility as both wound and training ground, how being overlooked can destroy you or prepare you, depending on what you build in the spaces no one's watching. Margaret built an empire in those spaces. She built expertise, independence, and a life that required no one's permission to be valuable, because she'd learned early that waiting for validation was waiting for something that would never come. Her $12 million weren't the point. They were just proof, visible, quantifiable proof, that the girl her family had deemed unremarkable was actually extraordinary. And when that proof emerged, her family's response confirmed what she'd always suspected. They didn't actually want her to be extraordinary. They wanted her to be useful. The lesson here cuts deeper than family dysfunction or financial success. It's about authenticity in the most fundamental sense. knowing your own worth independent of others' recognition, building value that exists whether or not anyone sees it, and having the courage to walk away from people who can only love the version of you that serves them. Margaret spent decades hoping her family would see her, really see her, and finally realized they'd been seeing her all along. They just didn't like what they saw because it didn't fit their narrative. She was supposed to be the stable one, the helpful one, the one who asked for nothing because she deserved nothing. When she became the successful one, the wealthy one, the one who'd exceeded every expectation they'd never bothered to have for her, it threatened the entire structure of their family mythology. So they attacked, not her success itself, but her privacy about that success, her refusal to let them rewrite her story to center them again. There's a question that haunts everyone who's ever been the overlooked child, the invisible sibling, the family member whose needs were always secondary. Do they deserve another chance? Could they change? Margaret's answer was no, and maybe that's the wrong answer for someone else's story. But it was her answer, earned through 45 years of evidence that her family's love was conditional, transactional, and ultimately shallow. They loved Caroline fiercely and completely. They loved the idea of Margaret, useful, uncomplicated, grateful Margaret. They couldn't love the real Margaret because they'd never tried to know her. And at some point, you have to stop offering people opportunities to disappoint you and start building a life with people who show up without being asked, who celebrate without being prompted, who see you without needing a business article to explain your worth. So what do you do if you see yourself in Margaret's story? If you're the child who learned self-sufficiency because no one was coming to help? If you've built something beautiful and find that the people who should celebrate you most are the ones who resent you loudest? You do what Margaret did. You authenticate. You look clearly at the relationships in your life and assess their value without sentiment clouding your vision. You ask yourself hard questions. Is this person proud of me, or just interested in what I can provide? Do they know me, or do they know the version of me that's convenient for them? Have they earned access to my success, or are they demanding it as a birthright they never honored? And then you make decisions based on honest answers, even when those answers hurt. You protect what you've built. You surround yourself with people who see you clearly. You stop performing gratitude for scraps of attention. You stop waiting for your family to become people they've proven, over decades, they're not capable of being. Margaret Hayes is living her life now in Charleston, still authenticating jewelry, still mentoring young women, still building. Her parents are aging without her involvement. Caroline is managing her own life without Margaret's financial support. And Margaret is learning slowly that freedom doesn't erase the wound, but it does let it heal. She's learning that you can grieve the family you needed while building the life you deserve. She's learning that being seen by the right people matters infinitely more than being seen by everyone. And she's learning, most importantly, that the girl who had to authenticate her own worth at 7 years old grew into a woman who could authenticate her own life, her own choices, her own freedom. And that's a kind of wealth that no family dysfunction can diminish and no amount of money can purchase. What about you? Are there people in your life who only see your value when it benefits them? Are you still waiting for recognition from people who've proven they'll never truly see you? What would it mean to authenticate your own worth, independent of their approval? The answers aren't easy, but Margaret's story suggests they might be essential. Because at the end of the day, the most valuable thing you can learn is this. You don't need anyone's permission to matter, not even your family's. You just need the courage to believe it yourself. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, if you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.